Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron. I hope you're having an incredible day or night in Jesus. Thank you so much for being with us. We're doing a little series here on monotheism. I encourage you to check out our other videos and our other videos on a host of other subjects going back many years. Thanks for being here. Join us daily, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Thank you so much. So we're looking at the argument of monotheism from the demand for total devotion. That when you read in the Bible, God demands total devotion. I will have no other gods before me. He's a jealous God. The spirit that's in us lusteth the jealousy. On and on. So we're in plato.stanford.edu, the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy. So the argument for the demand for total devotion, let's just read what it says here. We interact with it for use of text. According to William of Ockham, God can be understood in two ways. By God, one may mean something more noble and more perfect than anything else beside him, or one might mean that which nothing is more noble and more perfect. And that's fascinating. Occam is where you get Occam's razor. There's some other razors out there too. I'm not talking about Schick and all this. If God is understood in the first way, something more noble and more perfect than anything else beside him, I would say that's true, but that's not the totality of the truth about God. Then there can be only one God. For consider the following argument. Necessarily, if any being is God, it's more perfect than any other being. Therefore, necessarily, if there were two distinct beings, each were God, the first would be more perfect than the second. The second would be more perfect than the first. But it's impossible if there be two beings of which more perfect than the other. Obviously, that's a logical contradiction. Therefore, it's impossible for there to be two gods. But if God is understood in the second way, that which nothing is more noble and more perfect, Occam thinks that it cannot be shown that there's only one God. For it isn't clear that there couldn't be two equally perfect beings, each of whom was such that no actual possible being surpassed him. That's in Occam 139 to 140. Now, I would say that's not true. First of all, those definitions of God are incomplete. That God is all-knowing, and as we've seen in looking at proofs of monotheism from his perfection and his simplicity, it's impossible to have two all-perfect beings. It's just impossible because they're going to collapse into each other, being identical, because they couldn't have two separate centers of consciousness and at the same time be omnipotent and possess all wisdom, all love, all holiness, and all this. So he goes on to say, even if Occam is right about this, it does seem impossible that there be two gods, for it appears to be a conceptual truth that God is unsurpassable. That's true. If he is, then if there were two gods, each would be unsurpassable. Well, there can't be two unsurpassable beings, each of which is God, because they're going to have to surpass each other. For part of what it means to call something God is that it is an appropriate object of total devotion and unconditional commitment. If there were two unsurpassable beings, however, our devotion and commitment should be divided between them, as Scotus says. This is John Dunn Scotus, which when I try to type that, it's always trying to punch in like the abbreviation for the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. If there were two infinite goods, an orderly will could not be perfectly satisfied with but one infinite good. Since they're equally perfect, it would be inappropriate to be totally devoted or unconditionally committed to either one of them. How could you? Because if they both are deserving of worship, being both equally perfect, but I'm finite, how could I give my love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength? I couldn't. Which that's a very fascinating psychological phenomenon. J.T. Pugh had much incredible stuff to say about that. But if it would, then neither one of them would be God. So if it's conceptual truth that God is unsurpassable, he must be unique. An appeal to unsurpassability isn't really necessary, however, since God's uniqueness follows directly from his being an appropriate object of total devotion and unconditional commitment. We're going to skip over some of the things which he says there, but we're going to come to the last three conclusions. Necessarily, if there were two gods, we could be totally devoted and unconditionally committed to the first, totally devoted and unconditionally committed to the second. But it's impossible to be totally devoted and unconditionally committed to each of the two distinct beings. So it's impossible for there to be two gods. And I'm going to skip over some more here. It's perhaps less obvious why devotion can't be divided between two beings. But the best answer is probably this. The sort of devotion appropriate to God involves centering one's life in God, Christ who is our life. In him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. He had just written that when he said Christ who is our life. And while one can center one's life in X and Y, one can't center one's life in X and also center one's life in Y, because we only have one center. The devotion that God requires appears then to be inherently indivisible. In sum, neither of the first problems present an unsurmountable difficulty for the argument of total devotion. And so this goes back to argument from omnipotence and the argument of William of Ockham, an argument for the demand of total devotion. So if God demands total devotion, he has to be one. He can't be more than one, because it's impossible to totally devote yourself to one perfect being, more than one perfect being. So lots of understandings of God's monotheism. Scripture demands it. So God bless you. We'll talk with you later. Bye-bye.